a prolonged fall shortly after the conflict broke out. The labor force diminished as word spread that many of the country's young people had been deployed to the front or had left. The economy suffered as a result of Putin's decision to partially mobilize, and half of the corporate sector started having employee problems. There have been 14,022 sanctions placed on Russia since the pre-war era. Russia imposed these many sanctions on Iran, Syria, and North Korea before leaving. However, the European Union intends to levy taxes on the central bank of the Russian Federation's frozen assets. The legal concerns associated with a direct transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine were reportedly a major concern for European officials. It is worth noting that Estonia was the pioneer among EU countries in planning to send the money of Russian oligarchs to Ukraine. As a result of efforts by the Estonian government, Russians are now able to sell their confiscated property and transmit the earnings to the Ukrainian side of the conflict. After much discussion, European Union leaders have indicated their provisional approval for a specific plan to use blocked Russian assets in favor of Ukraine. Income tax on the Russian central bank's frozen assets is to be collected as part of the plan. We are discussing the possibility of imposing a tax of more than 200 billion euros on the central bank of the Russian Federation's uninvested capital gains. About 3 billion euros in annual interest and tax earnings will be allocated to Ukraine's reconstruction. The majority of the frozen Russian assets are liquid funds, such as bank accounts. The remaining sum is invested in a securities plan that will be cashed out over the next few years. European Union envoys have already broached the topic of such a mechanism with the White House, and they have updated their American allies on the discussion's progress. In this sense, European leaders are debating whether or not to seek the backing of all 7 members of the Group of 7. The regulatory body further stresses that legal action can be taken against the policy at issue. Interest and other income planned to be obtained through this technique have been attributed, by some accounts, to sanctioned assets that ultimately belong to the Russian side. According to one of the organization's contacts, utilizing the Russian Federation's frozen assets remains a challenging issue because no mature proposal can be adopted at the legislative level. It's safe to argue that Putin's rule in Russia could be toppled if the economy collapsed. However, experts estimate that Russia would spend $1 billion on a single day of war with Ukraine. Despite appearances, the Russian economy is in a downward spiral that threatens Vladimir Putin's rule. Russia spent $1 billion on the one-day conflict with Ukraine. The Kremlin is funding the invasion with billions of dollars earned from the sale of raw materials. Russia is barely making it by providing the Asian market with drastically discounted oil due to the reduction in energy prices brought on by Western sanctions. In light of this, the Russian government has instituted harsh tariffs and widespread robbery to fund its military operations in Ukraine. These kinds of actions undermine Putin's authority while also damaging his reputation in Russian society. It should come as no surprise that the planned military insurrection led by Wagner PMC leader Yevgeny Prigozhin failed to rally support for the Lord of the Kremlin among the people and elite of the Russian Federation. Analysts note that war defeat often precedes economic collapse and political upheaval in Russia. It is highlighted that the economic crisis should not be disregarded as a serious factor in the overthrow of despotic regimes, especially in terms of financing the war, despite the fact that it is rarely the only reason for a change of power. In contrast, following abnormally high prices in 2022, the ruble has steadily depreciated against the dollar and the euro since the beginning of this year. A military rebellion in Russia has contributed to the rapid depreciation of the ruble in recent days. Even though the military push was thwarted, the ruble has continued its gradual decline. The dollar traded for more than 89 rubles and the euro for more than 97 rubles on the Moscow Stock Exchange. It is extremely plausible that the dollar will soon cost 100 rubles and even later 200 rubles, as predicted by economic forecasters. The Russian treasury is starting to run low on funds as the government makes more and more commitments it cannot afford to meet. The treasury deficit, however, no longer seems urgent in light of the new ruble rate. In this aspect, the Russian government has no choice but to devalue the ruble. Experts point out that a change in government, like the one that occurred in the Russian Federation in 1991 or 1998, was responsible for ending the country's massive budget deficit. Therefore, the end goal of all Russian fiscal policy is to preserve budgetary stability. The ruble is under additional stress on the final trading day of the tax year. So how exactly is Putin using the Russian economy as a means to ensure his own survival? Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now 18 months old, and it has already been marred by a failed coup attempt last week, military defeats, and international diplomatic criticism. Ukrainian efforts are currently being made to stop the conflict. Where, therefore, should we focus our efforts if we want to bring an end to this war? We were all right in assuming that the Crimean Peninsula would be the dividing line between Ukraine and Russia. Russia's policies on the peninsula as of late have been mainly defensive. The Ukrainians are shooting drones and long-range missiles towards Crimea from all directions, which is the fundamental reason. Despite Russia's best efforts, Kiev's offensive preparations against Crimea only grew more ambitious as time went on. In particular, the British long-range Storm Shadow missile that was sent to Ukraine helps reinforce Kiev's ambitions for Crimea. Ukraine's top priority was to sever Russia's ties to Crimea, so they focused their efforts there. The Kerch Bridge, as seen here, the Kerch Bridge links the Russian city of Krasnodar on the Sea of Azov to the Russian invasion campaign in Ukraine. This bridge is analogous to the bloodstream of Russia's logistics and supply system. The Kerch Bridge is also considered a means of egress for pro-Moscow Crimean inhabitants and Russian military and political figures should the peninsula come under attack. Therefore, the Kerch Bridge has become the focal point of Ukrainian efforts to terminate the conflict and restore Russian control over the peninsula. The Ukrainians last stormed this bridge on October 8, 2022, if memory serves. Russian President Vladimir Putin's birthday was the day before. Ukrainian officials initially said the attack was meant to be a birthday surprise for Russia's president, but a new assault on the Kerch Bridge has since emerged. The impact of this shocking attack was felt all throughout the world. Using British-made Storm Shadow long-range missiles, the Ukrainian armed forces launched an attack on the Kerch Bridge. Putin's birthday is still a few days away, but the Ukrainians have already prepared an entirely new onslaught as a present for him. We believe that the attack on the Kerch Bridge was an early birthday present for the Russian leader this year. According to pro-Russian Sergei Aksanov, based in Crimea, the peninsula's air defense systems are currently operating at full capacity. Aksanov further elaborated by saying that a cruise missile had gone down not far from the bridge. The attack film was particularly remarkable due to the white smoke that appeared surrounding the Kerch Bridge. According to Russian officials, the attack on the Kerch Bridge severed a communication line stretching across 19 kilometers. Despite the lack of information, the Russians appear to be quite concerned. If the Storm Shadow missiles were launched from a distance of around 300 kilometers, their target would have been the Kerch Bridge. Last week, Ukrainian soldiers stationed short-range ballistic missiles close to the Crimean border. These new advancements demonstrate how easy it is to target the Kerch Bridge from afar. The strike on this bridge in Crimea demonstrated not only that Ukraine was taking far braver steps, but also that one of the most significant main supply routes for the Russians had been cut. Ukrainian President Zelensky made the announcement that Russian ships do not have veto power in the Black Sea. The president also predicted that foreigners would be wary of traveling to Crimea. Ukrainian missiles sank the Russian missile cruiser Moskva. Whether or not Zelensky's comments alluded to the attacks on the Kerch Bridge is unclear, but the Kiev authorities have chosen to remain silent on the matter for the time being. Evidently, no Ukrainian government representative has addressed the recent Kerch Bridge incident. Since Russia also threatened Ukraine with Navy forces, reports from international intelligence sources suggest that the Ukrainian army has begun taking steps to terminate the war, with the Storm Shadow missile attack on the Kerch Bridge following Zelensky's comments. By making these claims, Zelensky made it clear that he would not be intimidated by the Russians and that the Ukrainians would launch simultaneous attacks on both sides of the peninsula. An explosion happened a few weeks ago in Sevastopol, Russia's primary Black Sea Navy fleet port. The massive explosion shook the Russians on the peninsula. This is because there are still Russian ships in Sevastopol, despite Moscow's relocation of some of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to the port of Novora, SAS. As a result of the Ukrainian attacks on Sebastopol, Russian threats to blockade the Ukrainian shoreline with their navy have, in a sense, evaporated. As another example of the Ukrainian sensitivity to the situation in the Crimea, an airstrike was launched against a Russian military base in Krasnodar on the same dates. Residents of Crimea who were considering crossing the Kerch Bridge were concerned by reports of drone attacks on the nearby Krasnodar air base. The recent attacks on the peninsula have made Crimean residents more open to leaving, and the Kerch Bridge is a major exit point for them. All of these assaults in Crimea show that the Ukrainians are gaining more control over the peninsula and are free to launch UAV versus and long-range missiles at any time at any strategic location they choose. The people of Crimea seem to have no choice but to evacuate as a result of the current crisis. Those in Crimea don't have much time to think, as the war is just going to get worse and they'll soon have nowhere to go. When will we realize that the conflict is actually progressing? As you may have seen, tensions in Ukraine are at an all-time high. Moscow severely restricts the increase in the offensive operations of the Ukrainians in these regions, especially in places like Zaporizhzhia, Melitopol, and Kherson, as Kiev continues its offensive plans, especially on the southern front lines of the country, with the intention of building a connecting corridor extending to Crimea. Even though Kherson is governed by Ukrainians, the presence of Russian military troops in the area poses a significant threat to Crimea. However, Ukrainian forces intend to use Kherson's most important facilities to seize full control of Crimea. However, Ukraine may not be able to save Crimea with just the missiles that can go from Kherson to the peninsula. The West's, especially the United States, military backing is crucial in this regard. Even if the United States has pledged $800 million in military aid to Ukraine, the country desperately needs far more assistance. The West and the United States should supply the Ukrainian army with longer-range missile weapons if the Ukrainians intend to recapture Crimea. This is the only option for freeing Crimea. Fear and flight from the peninsula could be the result of drone strikes or partisan actions, but isn't a decisive win what Ukraine really wants. Long-range missiles should be used to strike Russian military facilities on the peninsula. However, Russia appears to be completely helpless in this situation. To prevent losing the peninsula, the Moscow authorities have prioritized defense only. We can see that Russian construction crews are still hard at work on Crimean fortifications and that they are attempting to set up a strong defense shield in other crucial ports across the peninsula, most notably Sebastopol. After the recent missile attack on the Kerch Bridge, what are the Ukrainians doing in response to the increased Russian defensive measures? In fact, the Ukrainians intend to pick up where they left off with their offensive plans. Ukrainians are also launching a significant military effort in the area around the Dnipro River, in addition to Crimea, Kherson, Melitopol, and Zaporizhzhia. The Russians had a number of boat casualties on this river the last time around. After this time, however, the Ukrainians ramped up their repressive attacks around Dnipro in an effort to surround Crimea from every direction. If the Ukrainians manage to secure all of the land along the Dnipro, it will cement Kiev's position as the dominant power in Kherson. As we discussed with Kherson, Crimea is a frontline area. So, in the Ukrainian war journey, every road really does end in Crimea. Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea appear to have been damaged by fighting on the country's eastern front lines as well. Kiev may be able to devote far more resources to its offensive plans in Crimea if the Ukrainian people are willing to seize control of the eastern front lines. Therefore, the opinions of specialists and analysts on war are not unreasonable. However, this theory can only be confirmed if the Ukrainians successfully seize control of the Crimea and the eastern and southern front lines. The Kerch Bridge served its intended purpose for the time being. Where then will the Ukrainians set their sights? In the following days, we will go march together. In its wars, the Russian armed forces often experienced devastating defeats. The Russians lost a lot of soldiers and machines when they failed to seize Kiev quickly. Moscow has had a lot on its plate as of late, what with dealing with internal rebellions, anti-war protests, and other significant issues. Furthermore, who Putin may be planning to purge military officers who are being held responsible for Russia's lack of accomplishments. Vladimir Putin, the current Russian leader, is aiming his ire at the country's highest military officials. There has been a lot of unrest in Moscow as of late due to allegations that Russian Chief of General Staff Larry Gerasimov has been sacked. In January, Putin named Gerasimov to lead Russian forces in Ukraine. The Russian leader is the target of public criticism at the moment. After the Russian general failed to show up to the Moscow Victory Day parade, rumors began circulating regarding his whereabouts. Since Yevgeny Prigozhin's unsuccessful insurrection as head of the Wagner Group, Gerasimov has been missing in action. General Gerasimov's preliminary information was likely removed at the recommendation of Alexei Arestovich, the president of Ukraine's military advisor. The charges that General Gerasimov had been fired were based on the Wagner uprising, which was examined as part of the process by which Vladimir Putin and his inner circle were considered for continued command of the country's military forces. Some say that Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner rebels, received assistance from Gerasimov. On the other hand, Prigozhin called for Gerasimov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's resignations on June 24th due to their handling of the war in Ukraine. Some Russian military bloggers and influential users of the messaging app Telegram have speculated that Gerasimov, 67, had been fired after he disappeared from public view for several days. On the other hand, Rybar, a Telegram channel covering the conflict in Ukraine, was cited by the Moscow Times, claimed that while Gerasimov retains his title as Chief of Staff, he has no role in addressing issues at the front. Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, 54, was appointed Air Force Commander in June 2022 and Deputy Commander of a force in Ukraine in April, as reported by Russian military bloggers and Rybar. On June 28, 4 days after the Prigozhin's unsuccessful insurrection, Rybar posted about it. Large-scale purges in the ranks of the RF armed forces and the ministry's crash test for allegiance were attributed in the Rybar report to PMC Wagner's armed insurrection. Those who support the Kremlin Vladimir Romanov, a blogger for the Russian armed forces, revealed that Teplinsky, not Gerasimov, was in charge of the war's day-to-day operations. Valery Gerasimov, the Russian Chief of Staff, was eventually spotted a few days later. Moscow just published a remarkable video showing him giving a briefing on the war in Ukraine amid allegations that Russian President Vladimir Putin had fired his top general, Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. The footage from the Russian Defense Ministry briefing shows Gerasimov listening to briefings and giving orders to his subordinates about how Russia will respond to Ukraine's increasing missile attacks on Russian territory and occupied Crimea. In this riveting video, Valery Gerasimov announced that the Russian Aerospace Forces and the main intelligence directorate had taken on the responsibility of continuing the systematic work of determining the storage and launch locations of missiles and other weapons of the enemy in order to plan preemptive attacks. That is, according to a statement released by the Russian Ministry of Defense, Gerasimov has directed the head of the Primary Intelligence Presidency and other officials to locate missile silos and launch sites and other enemy offensive weaponry to prepare for an attack ahead of time. However, in the released briefing video, Gerasimov urged higher-ups to speed up plans to beef up the installation's defenses against aerial assaults. Video from Russia's Ministry of Defense shows that Servikin's deputy, Viktor Akselov, briefed Defense Minister Gerasimov via video link on the Russian Aerospace Forces. Colonel General Viktor Akselov's report, which is cited in the video, states that 2 air defense systems shot down S-200 missiles, while electronic countermeasures thwarted 2 more. Nothing was broken or killed. Following reports from Russian military bloggers that Gerasimov had been fired in the wake of the June 24th mutiny by Wagner, this disturbing video was revealed. There was something else about the footage that stood out. Although Akselov's and the other attendees' faces were obscured, Suravikin, Valery Gerasimov's deputy, was noticeably absent from the meeting. General Sergei Suravikin, his predecessor, has been missing ever since Prigozhin reached an arrangement with the Kremlin to put an end to his revolt in exchange for the dismissal of insurgent charges. Recent media coverage raised questions about whether or not Suravikin knew of Wagner's revolt preparations, and probably got arrested or interrogated for a while. Surovikin, during his 3 months at the helm, ordered a series of devastating drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure with the departure from the city of Kherson. However, after the army uprisings of both General Sergei Surovikin, Gerasimov's deputy predecessor, and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, the Wagner Group emerged. That Prigozhin's appeal for Putin's removal from office had been disregarded. More questions have been raised about what is happening behind the scenes because Prigozhin and the top field commander sat with Putin in several days after Putin termed his actions a treacherous backstab that may plunge Russia into a chaotic civil war. According to Putin's spokeswoman, 35 people were invited to the 3-hour meeting. All Prigozhin and Wagner field commanders are included. According to Peskov, the Wagner commanders vowed their continued support for Putin during the meeting in the Kremlin. These developments, however, proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the Wagner Group could not be trusted by the Moscow government, the Russian Ministry of Defense, or the Russian Armed Forces. The fact that Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov made public appearances and spoke about his new mission demonstrates the total breakdown in ties between the Russian armed forces in Moscow and Vladimir Putin's ongoing efforts to deflect blame for Russia's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine. Keeping Gerasimov on as Putin's Chief of Staff, according to retired Australian Army Major General Nick Ryan, as the Russian Ministry of Defense says, it has dismissed numerous high-ranking military officers on a daily basis, including prominent generals like Valery Gerasimov and Sergei Surovikin. Some military analysts and experts argue that the true problem lies with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. 2 more commanders were reportedly relieved of their duties as a result of battlefield casualties, according to a telegraph channel operated by the Ukrainian Ministry of the Interior. According to the telegrams, Admiral Igor Osipov, head of the Black Sea Fleet, had been overthrown and detained, and Lieutenant General Vladislav Ersho, commander of the 6th Army, had also been sacked. It was reported that Lieutenant General Sergei Kissel and one of his deputy commanders, as well as Major General Arkady Marzuk, commander of the 22nd Army Corps of the Southern Military District, had been removed from their positions. Concerning the impending purge and expulsion of the Russian chiefs of staff and senior Russian commanders, UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace has expressed his concerns. Wallace warned that having complete control over everything in the Russian system could end badly. Ben Wallace is dead on the money here. There is a pressure point between the Russian military and Moscow. The Russian General Staff seems to be taking the blame for ex-KGB spy Mr. Putin's mess, despite widespread admiration for Putin as a strong leader. When will Putin's luck run out? The Russian leader is planning for his own demise even as he blames the Russian armed forces, commanders, and chiefs of staff for his own faults. Because the successes of the Ukrainian armed forces on the front lines and the reactions of Russian citizens to this situation will eventually guarantee that the arrows of criticism will turn completely to Putin, even if he tries to save himself from the fire in the short term by using high-ranking commanders like Gerasimov and Surovikin. Maybe by then, the Russian leader will have missed his chance. We appreciate your attention.
Jag snurrar runt ett tag, men fallet, det var mjukt. Och som en hyena skrattar jag för allting, det var så sjukt. Ha, 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 ha. Ha, 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 ha. Ha, 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 ha. Ha, ha, ha. Men rädslan den tog över han och ändrade mitt rus. Jag blir aldrig normal igen, jag hamnar på dårhus. Ville bara sova nu, men fick ej en blund. För hjärnan tänkte 107 tankar per sekund. Man lärdom av mitt misstag folk. Håll dig lugn och trygg. Blicken upp, röken upp. Jag var ensam för min rygg. Och på grund av det jag på mentalsjukhus. En madrasserad cell. Där är en låg, vackert grön. Det var stort, tyst och skönt. Men så kom vite man och ville dra en järnväg fram. Hans tjut, blod och död. Han sprang ut, ond och röd. Men hans fru sa det var red. Kila ut och hämta ved. Och sa den tappre sist och igång. Vilda västern är i förut. Och sa den tappre siste nog igång. Vilda västern är i förut. Så i galopp hem han for och väsa upp yxan stod. Men hans fru tog ett spjut och stack det i hans slut. Och sa den tappre siste nog igång. Vilda västern är i förut. Och sa den tappre siste nog igång. Vilda västern är i förut. Järnvägslok spottar rök. Hövding stod runt om trök. Vit man sa sånt är mörk. Ni blir bra konduktör. Och sa den tappre siste nog en gång. Vilda västern är i förut. Och sa den tappre siste nog en gång. Vilda västern är i förut. Vilda västern är